So this course deals with intellectual history in the modern period. European historians traditionally begin modernity in 1789 with the French Revolution. Why? That's arbitrary in a lot of ways. You'll find out more on Friday about why it's the case. A lot of it has to do with things being very France-centered. Some of it has to do with our being snobs and think that everything important happens in Paris. But the convention is to date modernity beginning with 1789. What is modernity? It's a break in time. It's a break in time that transitions us into a different historical period in European history. It's a break with tradition. A lot of it has to do with not only a break with time in terms of a new historical period, but in terms of a change in the conception of time. And I'll keep going back to this idea of temporality. And one of the big shifts that's happened is that we move from a dominant notion of time as something that happens in a cyclical manner to a dominant notion of time that happens in a forward-going manner, in a progressive manner. How many of you have seen Fiddler on the Roof? Oh, a lot of you. Okay, if you haven't, you can all watch the movie on the internet this weekend. Okay, so the hero of Fiddler on the Roof is this guy Tevye, the dairyman, who lives in the Pale of Settlement in the part of the Tsarist Russian Empire where it was permissible for Jews to live. And as you might remember, the film begins with a trauma, or the story, the play, which is based on the novels. Begins innocently enough. The first trauma is romantic love. So Tevye's oldest daughter, Tzeitel, doesn't want to marry the wealthy butcher that her parents have chosen for her. She wants to marry the poor tailor. Why does she want to marry the poor tailor? She wants to marry the poor tailor because she loves him. Romantic love is the first trauma of modernity that falls down upon Tevye's head. Then his second daughter, Huddle, wants to marry a revolutionary Marxist. Then his third daughter, Haya, wants to marry a non-Jew. Then come pogroms, expulsions, revolution. Basically, modernity is just one horrible trauma for poor Tevye the dairyman. It kind of all spirals downhill from romantic love to revolutionary Marxism, assimilation, pogroms, homelessness. It's a trauma. And I start with that because modernity is generally a trauma. Modernity is a crisis, it's a trauma. All of the thinkers we're going to study in various ways experience it painfully and are trying to work their way through it. The very short version of modernity is it's an attempt to replace God. What happens in the Enlightenment is first we kind of move God off to the sidelines, out of center stage, and then eventually Nietzsche's going to come and kill off God. The short version of the story is that modernity is an attempt to replace God with something else that's stable, that holds things together. And the shorter version of that story is that it's really, really tough to replace God. Because God performs these simultaneous epistemological, ontological, and ethical functions. So epistemological refers to knowledge, ontological refers to the nature of being, ethical, you know what ethical means. God fulfills all these purposes. So you get rid of God, you've got a big gap to fill. And what are you going to put in God's place? Are you going to put history with a capital H? Are you going to put man with a capital M? There's a lot of tension that will keep playing out between subjectivity, a kind of turn to the self, and teleology, a turn to the forward motion of time. The forward motion of time moving towards a certain goal in a kind of progressive manner. The central problem of modernity has to do with the destabilization produced by that loss of God and that attempt to replace God. And I'll tell you another anecdote to give you a sense of that. So years ago, my son is now 13 and would be embarrassed if I continued telling these anecdotes, but he's not here at the moment. So now that this is being filled, And when he was 1, my brother and sister-in-law bought him for Christmas a baby piano. And so I was at my parents-in-law's house in rural Ohio on the floor trying to figure out how to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star on the baby piano. I am unfortunately musically illiterate, which is very ironic because I'm the sister of a musical prodigy who's an opera composer, but I have no musical talent whatsoever. I don't even read music. I was on the floor trying to just figure out Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star on the baby piano, which was already a big mental challenge for me. Then my brother-in-law, who is a professor of literature in Oklahoma, was reading a Kafka novel. I don't remember which one. He left it on the sofa and he went out for a walk. My father-in-law, who's a retired veterinarian, comes in, sits down on the sofa next to me and my son, and picks up the Kafka novel. And the first sentence of the introduction, he opens it up. He says, in this novel, as in all of his work, Kafka deals with the central problem of modernity. So my father-in-law turns to me and says, what is the central problem of modernity? And I look up, I said, oh, alienation. And he said, how do you know it's alienation? I said, obviously, it's alienation. We all know it's alienation. The central problem of modernity is the problem of alienation. And then I was completely consumed with trying to figure out how to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And he kept reading, and then we went on to talk about alienation. The central problem of modernity is the problem of alienation. What does it mean to be homeless in the world once we have gotten rid of God and there's nothing else holding things together? Once you get rid of God, you've got a lot of work to do to make up for God's absence. And the short version is that it generally doesn't go very well.